She's more than a Hollywood legend, more than the voice that ruled every decade since the 1962nd. Behind that golden smile is a wound she never escaped, an emptiness carved by loss, a heartbreak so deep it haunted her for a lifetime. At 83, Barbra Streisand finally faces the truth. All the fame in the world could not silence the one secret that nearly broke her. The story of Barbra's heartbreak begins not in the spotlight, but in silence. In August 1943, when she was just 15 months old, her father, Emmanuel, collapsed during an epileptic sighture. A simple injection meant to save him was botched, and instead, it stole his breath forever. Sudden, cruel, final. Barbra never heard his voice, never felt his arms around her, never even saw a photograph to prove he had lived. She would later confess with haunting clarity, "There was never a picture of my father in the house. It was as if he never existed. All that remained was a bundle of his books, tied with string and shoved into a basement corner, like even memory itself had been silenced." For the little girl who would one day command the world stage, her very first chapter was written in absence. And absence has a way of echoing louder than sound. If losing her father left a hole in Barbra's heart, life at home only deepened the wound. Her mother, Diana, drowned in grief and depression, could not offer the tenderness her daughter craved. By 1949, when Barbra was only 7, Diana remarried in secret. No explanation, no gentle preparation, just one day. A stranger appeared in their cramped Brooklyn apartment. His name was Louis Kind, her stepfather. But instead of protection, he brought rejection. He was cold, dismissive, impossible to please. Barbra tried everything, fetching his slippers, calling him dad, tiptoeing quietly through the apartment, as if her silence could buy his love. But nothing softened him. Years later, she would recall with the blunt honesty of a child who never forgot. Did he like me? No, not at all. The apartment itself felt like a prison. Barbra slept in the same room as her mother and brother. 3 beds squeezed into 4 walls that offered no privacy. No sanctuary. There was no living room. No safe corner to dream. She didn't close a bedroom door behind her until she was 16 years old. Imagine that, 16 years without a space to call her own. Perhaps that's why later in life she clung so fiercely to beautiful homes and tranquil gardens. They weren't luxuries. They were compensation for what had been stolen in her most fragile years. As if silence and rejection weren't enough, the one voice that should have comforted her, the voice of her mother, became the harshest sound of all. Diana didn't sing lullabies. She didn't whisper "I love you" into Barbra's ear. Instead, her words landed like blows. "You're not pretty enough. Your nose is too big. That strange voice of yours will never take you anywhere." Imagine being a child, desperate for approval, and hearing only criticism where comfort should have been. The very person who should have been her shield became her sharpest critic. Even decades later, when the world rose to its feet in thunderous applause, Barbra admitted, "My mother never told me she loved me, or that she was proud of me." But here's the paradox from that rejection. Something else was born, a defiance, a quiet fire that whispered maybe her voice wasn't a flaw at all. Maybe it was salvation. Each cruel word that tried to shrink her only carved out more room for ambition. Those early wounds didn't fade. They became the echo she carried into every love affair, every marriage, every song, and even as she stood on glittering stages draped in sequins, clutching golden statues, there was still a Brooklyn girl inside, aching for the warmth she never received. At 16, Barbra had finally had enough of the suffocating walls in Brooklyn. With no fanfare, no mother at the door wishing her luck, she picked up a second-hand suitcase and walked into Manhattan alone. There was no money tucked in her pocket, No warm embrace to send her on her way. Only silence. And the sting of words that still echoed in her mind, "You're not pretty enough. Your nose is too big. Your voice is too strange." Most girls would have broken under that weight, but Barbra carried it like fuel. If she was going to be unloved at home, she would find belonging somewhere else, even if it meant starving for it. The first years in New York were brutal. She rented airless rooms in boarding houses, rooms so cold in winter. She slept with her coat buttoned to the neck. Dinner was often just a slice of bread or a weak cup of tea, meals that tasted more of loneliness than food. By day, she auditioned relentlessly. Casting directors looked her up and down, dismissing her before she even opened her mouth. When she did sing raw, aching, unforgettable, they told her no. Not because her voice faltered, but because of the face that carried it. One director, unmoved by her brilliance, delivered the cruelest verdict: "You'll never make it. You don't have the face for it." Humiliating, crushing, but not enough to break her. Again and again, people told her the same thing: "Fix your nose. Smooth your voice. Be less strange." To them, her flaws were obstacles. But to Barbra, they were the very core of who she was. One night, after another humiliating rejection, she sat on a narrow bed in her tiny room, clutching a pillow, as if it could absorb the weight of her dreams. The city outside glowed with lights for someone else, but inside, she made a vow that would define her life. "If I am going to fail, I'd rather fail as me." It wasn't arrogance. It was survival. To erase her nose, to tame her voice, to polish away her stubbornness would be to erase herself. And she'd already grown up invisible, fighting to prove she even existed. She refused to disappear again. That decision, reckless to some, became her shield. Every insult became kindling. Every dismissal, another spark. Her flaws did not hold her back. They lit her fire. The vow she made in that tiny room did not bring instant miracles. Nights were still long, cold, and merciless. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to shift. In 1960, at just 18, Barbra stood in the smoky haze of a little Greenwich Village club. Dressed in gowns she had stitched from thrift store scraps, she opened her mouth, and suddenly the air in the room changed. The chatter stopped. People leaned in. It was as if the audience had been waiting their whole lives for a voice like hers. The strange girl from Brooklyn, mocked for her looks, was suddenly unforgettable. Whispers of her name traveled from table to table. Then, from street to street, they came back the next night. And the next. By 1962, at just 19, she stepped onto a Broadway stage in "I Can Get It For You Wholesale." Her role was small, but her presence was volcanic. The audience couldn't look away. For the first time, the world saw what she had always refused to hide. The very flaws that critics told her to fix had become her crown. By 1964, the world could no longer look away. On Broadway, Barbra became the living embodiment of funny girl Fanny Brice, the awkward outsider who triumphed through sheer talent. It was more than a role. It was her own reflection staring back from the stage. Every note she sang felt like defiance. Every ovation proof that she had turned wounds into weapons. 4 years later, Hollywood crowned her. In 1968, at just 26 years old, she clutched the Academy Award for the film version of Funny Girl. The little Brooklyn girl who once begged for approval now stood in front of the entire world. Radiant, unshakable, or so it seemed. Yet behind the glittering smile was a storm. Even in that dazzling moment, she admitted later, "I felt more trapped than free." Because when you win so young, there's only one direction left to fall. That golden statue was not just a victory, It was a warning. Every song, every performance, every role after that night had to be flawless. Any slip, she feared, would send her crashing from the pedestal the world had placed her on. The Oscar had lifted Barbra to the highest peak. But the view from the top was suffocating. From that night onward, she became her own harshest judge. Every detail mattered. Every camera angle. Every costume stitch. Every shaft of light on her face. She could no longer simply sing. She had to control everything. Because if one thing wasn't perfect, the triumph felt hollow. What had once been joy now became exhaustion. Nights of rehearsals turned into battles with herself. And searching for flaws no one else could see. Applause roared around her. But instead of comfort, it only deepened her fear. What if tomorrow it isn't enough? What if they finally see through me? And as if her own doubts weren't punishing enough. The world joined in. Tabloids circled her, like vultures. Columnists sneered at her ambition. Comedians mocked her nose as if her entire identity were a punchline. The very qualities that had made her unforgettable now became weapons thrown back at her. For a woman who had grown up starving for affection, every cruel word cut deeper than a standing ovation could ever heal. To the world, she was a goddess. To the media, she was a caricature. To herself, she was trapped too perfect to be human. Too human to be perfect. It was supposed to be the crowning night of her career. In the summer of 1967, Barbra stood in Central Park before more than 130,000 people, an ocean of faces, a tide of expectation. She began to sing, her voice soaring as it always had, until suddenly, it wasn't there. The words slipped from her memory. The lyrics vanished. In that instant, the woman the world saw as untouchable froze. Her body stiffened, her mind blank, her voice strangled by terror. She later admitted, "I remember standing there, frozen. I couldn't move. I couldn't sing." The humiliation was unbearable. To the audience, it was just a fleeting stumble. To Barbra, it was an earthquake that split the ground beneath her feet. The fear wrapped around her like chains, and it never let go. For nearly 3 decades, 27 long years, the greatest voice of her generation avoided the very stage that had made her a star. Imagine it, a singer whose songs could shake the world hiding in silence, afraid of the one place where she belonged most. Even as she triumphed in film and recordings, the wound from that night never closed. It was proof that even legends can bleed, and even icons can be undone by fear. In 1983, Barbra did something no woman in Hollywood had dared to attempt at her scale. She directed, co-wrote, produced, and starred in Yentl, a story that lived deep inside her heart. It was more than a film. It was a declaration that her voice could not be contained to a stage or a microphone. The movie was praised, even groundbreaking, but the backlash was merciless. Men who called themselves visionaries were celebrated for less. Barbra, on the other hand, was branded controlling, arrogant, a tyrant. The same passion that won her Grammys and Oscars was suddenly twisted into accusations. She remembered it with quiet pain. "I wasn't trying to be powerful. I was just trying to tell the story the way it lived inside me." But in Hollywood, a woman's ambition was not seen as art. It was seen as a threat. Imagine the isolation. She had risked everything, laid her soul bare, and still the world found a way to wound her. For a woman who had fought since childhood to be seen and heard, the rejection cut as deep as her mother's words once had. Yet even in the hurt, she refused to retreat. The girl who once slept in a room with no door was still there now, fighting for the right to open doors for women who would follow. Barbra had achieved what no other artist in history ever had. She topped the charts in every single decade since the 1000 962nd, to the world. It looked like perfection. Awards lined her shelves. Her voice filled the airwaves. And her name had become untouchable. But inside, triumph was laced with torment. Each new album, each new performance carried the same silent dread. Will this be the one that breaks the chain? Will this be the moment they stop believing in me? The higher she climbed, the thinner the air became, and the harder it was to breathe. Glory became heavy. Fame became fragile. The same spotlight that crowned her also burned her, exposing her every flaw for critics to feast on. She lived in a paradox, adored by millions, yet perpetually misunderstood, worshipped from afar, but starved for closeness. People see the glamour, she reflected later, but they don't know the hurt. They don't know how words can wound more than silence. She stood draped in gowns, embraced by applause. But when the lights went down, she was still that little Brooklyn girl aching for love she could never quite hold on to. Amid the noise of fame and the loneliness of endless applause, Barbra finally met someone who looked past the legend and saw the woman. His name was Elliot Gould. He wasn't dazzled by her volcanic voice or her unconventional beauty. Instead, he disarmed her with something far rarer, an easy steadiness, a boyish irreverence, a refusal to treat her like a goddess. For a girl who had grown up fatherless, style for fiction, his attention felt like oxygen. She later admitted, "Elliot was the first man who really saw me." And for Barbra, that kind of recognition was intoxicating. In March 1963, at only 21, she married him quietly. No red carpets, no grand spectacle, just a private vow to belong to someone at last. Their early years were tender and ordinary, cramped New York apartments. Second-hand furniture, takeout cartons balanced on their knees. Nights filled with laughter after rehearsals. For the first time in her life, she tasted belonging. Not to an audience, but to one person. She could let her guard down, slip off the mask, and believe that love might heal the wounds applause never touched. What began as tenderness soon collided with the cruelest test of all, fame. In 1964, Funny Girl catapulted Barbra into superstardom. Audiences couldn't get enough of her. But at home, Elliot felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. He was an actor too, but his rising career was quickly eclipsed by the tidal wave of her success. By 1966, when their son Jason was born, the strain was already unbearable. Barbra adored her baby, but her schedule was relentless: film contracts, recording sessions, tours that pulled her away night after night. Elliot longed for a wife who could stay still, to build a quiet family life. But Barbra feared that if she slowed down for even a moment, everything she had built would vanish. "I was torn in two," she later admitted. Arguments filled the silence of their home over missed dinners, over who would rock Jason to sleep at 3 a.m., over the simple question of how to breathe when their lives no longer moved in rhythm. Behind the doors of their apartment, the young couple was unraveling. Even as the world crowned Barbra its queen, by 1971, the marriage collapsed. She was only 29. To the tabloids, it was just another celebrity divorce. But to Barbra, it was devastation. It was like a death. She confessed a funeral for the love she had once believed could save her. From the wreckage of her broken marriage, Barbra clung to one anchor: her son, Jason. If love between adults had failed her, then motherhood would become the role she refused to abandon. She poured into him all the tenderness she had been denied as a child. Every kiss on his forehead, every whispered lullaby was her way of rewriting her own past, of giving Jason the unconditional love she had once begged for and never received. As Jason grew, their bond only deepened, and when he came out as gay in the 1000, 992nd at a time when Hollywood preferred silence. When countless stars hid in fear, Barbra did the opposite. She stood proudly beside him. She became one of the first major voices in Hollywood to champion LGBTQ+ rights, funding advocacy groups, speaking out in interviews, and using her fame as a shield for her son and for others who had none. "My son taught me courage," she reflected years later. "He gave me the chance to love without condition, without fear." For a woman who had once been told she wasn't enough, never pretty enough, never worthy enough, Jason's honesty gave her a mirror of authenticity. In loving him freely, she finally discovered the freedom to love herself. Every scar left by her marriage, every cruel word from her mother, every wound of childhood found its answer in that one truth: love without conditions can heal the deepest breaks. It was 1968, and Barbra's star had never burned brighter. On screen in Funny Girl, she sparred and sparkled opposite the magnetic Omar Sharif. Their chemistry was electric, too electric. Every glance, every laugh between them carried something unscripted, something dangerous. To audiences, it was dazzling magic. To those behind the curtain, it looked alarmingly real. The timing could not have been more volatile. Barbra's marriage to Elliot had already collapsed, her heart raw and searching. Omar, a global star with a charisma that filled every room, and became more than a co-star. He became temptation. Tabloids smelled blood. They feasted on rumors, splashing headlines across front pages, turning her crowning triumph into a scandal. For Barbra, it wasn't about image. It was about honesty. She never denied the spark, and never tried to bury what the whole world had already seen. Years later, she would acknowledge it with an almost unapologetic candor. Fleeting or not, desire deserved to be remembered. But like fire, it was too hot to hold. Omar drifted back to his world. Barbra pressed on in hers. The affair, whether real or whispered into being, left behind a scar, a reminder that even at her most untouchable, she was still a woman vulnerable to longing, to risk, to the kind of passion that burns brightest when it cannot last. After Omar, Barbra's heart wandered through three very different landscapes of love, each one dazzling in its own way, and each one destined to slip through her fingers. With Pierre Trudeau, Canada's enigmatic Prime Minister, she found something she had never known before: an intellectual bond. Their private dinners stretched long into the night, filled not with seduction, but with debate about books, about politics, about the burden of carrying power. "He made me feel seen in a way applause never did," she later confessed. For once, she wasn't a star. She was simply a woman, listened to, respected, yet duty tethered him to his nation. And the romance faded like an unfinished sentence, leaving her with wistful admiration instead of heartbreak. Then came Don Johnson, the golden boy of the 1982nd, all charm and flashbulbs. With him, she tasted Hollywood glamour in its purest form: red carpets, premieres, endless photographs of two stars colliding in a blaze of spectacle. It was intoxicating but hollow. A fireworks show over too quickly. Beneath the glitter, there was little to hold them together. When it ended, it was not tragedy but inevitability. And then, Andre Agassi, brash, magnetic, nearly 3 decades younger. He was a tennis prodigy with the raw heat of youth. To the tabloids, it was scandal. To Barbra, it was liberation. Late-night phone calls, stolen kisses, the thrill of refusing to care what the world thought. Their love could not endure, their lives moved at different speeds, but it gave her something she never expected: the courage to love boldly, without apology. Even in her 50s. 3 men, 3 lessons, intellect, glamour, daring, each romance, a fragment of the love she had spent her life chasing, yet none gave her the home she longed for. By the mid-1992nd, Barbra had lived through every shade of love, ecstatic beginnings, shattering endings, and fleeting flames that dazzled but did not last. She had begun to believe that perhaps true partnership wasn't written for her. She was too famous, too complicated, too much. And then came James Brolin. Their meeting was almost ordinary. Arranged by friends who thought they might enjoy each other's company. Neither expected sparks. Barbra arrived guarded, her defenses high. James showed up with his hair freshly cut short, almost comically so. Barbra teased, "You look nearly bald." Instead of taking offense, he burst out laughing. That laughter changed everything. For decades, men had either worshipped her, feared her, or resented her. James did none of those things. He simply laughed with her. In that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt since girlhood ease. Here was a man who wasn't dazzled by Barbra Streisand, the icon, but charmed by Barbra, the woman. His steadiness disarmed her. His humor softened her, and his quiet confidence gave her permission to breathe. "He hears me," she would later say, "not just my voice, but me." 2 years later, on a summer day in 1998, they married in her Malibu garden, surrounded not by flashing cameras, but by roses and close friends. Barbra did not shine as a star that day. She glowed as a woman who, after half a century of searching, had finally come home. Unlike the romances before it, Barbra's love with James was not written in headlines, but in habits. There were no scandals to feed the tabloids, no fiery spectacles to dazzle the public. What they built was quieter and infinitely stronger. They shared morning coffee at the kitchen table. Side by side, in the calm of Malibu, they walked their dogs along the cliffs, the Pacific wind carrying their laughter. They planted roses in the garden, watching them bloom year after year, each petal a small testament to endurance. At night, instead of premieres and cameras, they curled up with movies, 2 ordinary souls, savoring ordinary joys. For the world, she remained the diva with Grammys and Oscars, but in James's presence, she could exhale. She didn't have to be perfect, or dazzling, or untouchable. She could simply be a wife, a partner, a woman who was finally loved for herself. She welcomed his children into her heart, and James embraced her son Jason with equal warmth, creating a blended family that was stitched together not by obligation, but by choice. For Barbra, who had once grown up starved of tenderness, this was redemption. A family where love did not have to be earned. Hollywood marriages often flickered like matches and burned out in the glare of cameras. But Barbra and James marked 5 years, then 10, then 20 silver anniversaries quietly celebrated. Not flaunted. Their love endured not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. For Barbra, love with James gave her peace, but her sanctuaries gave her permanence. Every home, every garden, every carefully chosen treasure was more than luxury. They were monuments to survival. Her Malibu estate was her crown jewel, not just for its sweeping ocean views, but for what it symbolized. This was the place where she married James in a garden bursting with roses, where she found refuge during California wildfires, where she built a private utopia, brick by brick. "My home is my canvas," she once said. And in Malibu, she painted her masterpiece. New York also bore the imprint of her triumph. From a modest Brooklyn apartment with no living room, she had risen to an Upper East Side townhouse and a Central Park penthouse overlooking the city that once doubted her. Every address was a milestone, proof that she had turned ridicule into reverence. Even her cars and collections told her story. The Bentley that marked her funny girl breakthrough, the Mercedes that carried her through Yentl, the restored Rolls-Royce, gleaming as if time itself could be polished. And below her Malibu home, her private museum, a whimsical world of dolls, antique, Americana objects once discarded, rescued and restored with dignity. Just as she herself had been underestimated, she gave these forgotten things a second life. To outsiders, it looked like extravagance. To those who understood, it was a language of resilience. Every rosebush, every artifact, every brick whispered, "I survived. I endured. I built a sanctuary no one could take from me." And yet, for all the wealth and splendor, Barbra knew the truth. The stages will dim. The trophies will gather dust. The numbers on bank sheets will fade. What endures is love, the courage to give it, to receive it, and to turn it outward into compassion. Her legacy is not just measured in Grammys or millions, but in the way she taught us to remain unyielding in truth, generous in spirit, and tender without apology. She proved that the bravest act is not conquering the world, but refusing to let heartbreak harden the heart.